Good evening, everybody. Most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Mark Mulligan. I'm an adjunct associate professor in the architecture department. I'm also the director of the MArch degree program here. My role tonight is double. I'm just introducing our moderator, Ken Oshima, who is also the curator of the exhibition and the co-designer of the beautiful layout of the exhibition you see outside. I will also be contributing some thoughts in what we hope will be a fairly informal discussion up front. We want it to be a very inclusive event tonight, so I'll let Ken sort of set the rules, but overall he's told me that he wants this room set up and everything about this was not meant to be a typical Piper lecture, but in fact to be a kind of discussion so that people feel really involved in the work of this exhibition and the work of this architect. Okay, let me get to my immediate task here, which is to introduce Ken Tadashi Oshima. He is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Washington. He has a BA from Harvard University, an MArch from UC Berkeley, and a PhD from Columbia, where he studied with Barry Bergdahl and Kenneth Frampton and Henry Smith. Excuse me for. And his topic was Japanese modernism, and he has since gone on to write several books. Most important of these, I would say, is the 2010 book, The International Architecture in Interwar Japan, Constructing Kokusai Kenchiku, which is, I think, focuses on a very, very interesting period of Japanese modernism, and really one that had not been very well covered by other authors, but is completely important if we like to believe that today's modernism has a lot of ties to Japanese tradition. We have to understand how that continuity of history flowed through what some people would like to forget as that sort of uncomfortable period of interwar Japan, where maybe the politics weren't so friendly to, seen from these shores. So his book focuses on three figures: Sutemi Horiguchi, Mamoru Yamada, and Anthony Raymond, an American architect whose practice was based in Tokyo. He also co-curated a traveling exhibition on the work of Antonin and Noemi Raymond that began at UPenn and then traveled to UC Santa Barbara and on to Tokyo and other places. He has more recently written a book called Global Ends Towards the Beginning, which looks at global practices, cutting-edge contemporary design practices in places like Singapore, Tokyo, Australia, Chile, and so on, places in Europe. Ken has been a frequent visitor to the GSD. He taught a course in 2008 called The Modern Japanese Home that was very popular here. More recently, he was on sabbatical in Tokyo this past year while he was putting together this exhibition and writing a new book, soon to come out. You can maybe tell them about that. But he also taught a group of 12 GSD students who were studying with Toyo Ito this past spring in a semester abroad program. Ken taught them a course called Metabolic Tokyo. I think it was part of also his research at the time for his book. And without further ado, maybe I'll turn the table over to Ken. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Mark. It's really great to be here at the GSD and see actually a lot of familiar faces from the Tokyo studio, where we parted in April, and to bring that back to the GSD of the change that we witnessed in Tokyo, that hopefully you can start to see in the Kikutake exhibition. It is kind of an auspicious day to be on 9/11, the 11th anniversary, but I think that signals some constant change that we're faced with. And looking at Kikutake's work, himself facing change after World War II, and the ensuing decades that I think are really interesting to see through his progression in the work that is in the walls here at the GSD. I think it's also really unique to have an architecture school that embraces such an exhibition that's both historic, but also, I think, its resonance with contemporary architectural culture, so that we have the kind of past, present, and future. So rather than just repeat what's on the walls. Hopefully everyone will get a chance to read that carefully or over the course of the next few months as the exhibition is up. You'll be able to look at that. But today I had hoped that we can really start to engage some of the issues that the exhibition raises and have the multiple voices that I think are important in understanding the scope and the breadth and the depth of this. And so rather than having it as a single lecture, more as a dialogue, and then also walking through the exhibition and pointing out things that you might not see otherwise. And so be a little bit like the extra features on the DVD. And so there is some bonuses that you get for coming here. There are some things that aren't on the walls that we'll see and hear about that I think will hopefully bring this alive. We don't want to belabor this, and so we'll try and go quickly in getting a number of the different perspectives and open this up to hopefully a broader discussion that we can continue in Stubbins here and continue out in the exhibition space to see all different things that I think, again, this exhibition raises with the models, the drawings, the sketches, but also how it creates a space. And so, actually, let me introduce everyone who will say a few words first. My colleague, collaborator in this through many Skype discussions, late night in Tokyo, early morning in Cambridge, Dan Borelli, Director of Exhibitions here, who's been absolutely brilliant in realizing the visions that I think are embodied in the work in the present day. We're also very fortunate to have Emeritus Professor Fred Thompson from the University of Waterloo, who worked with Kikutake in this most vital period between 1960 and 1963. And so we'll get the live account of what it was to be working on these projects, the drawings, that some special sketches that we've just added, some of the added features. Mark will add some more commentary, I think really bringing it to the context of the GSD, the curriculum. As program director here, he sees very vividly, but also having worked for Maki, who, Fumihiko Maki, who is one of the metabolists, part of the same generation, and understanding it from that practice, and also in terms of building the tectonic construction, that I think the models really elaborate in many very wonderful ways. We're also very fortunate to have Seng Kwan here, graduate of the PhD program here, who completed a dissertation on Tange, and also was the curator of the Tange exhibition here at the GSD that some of you probably remember, and to tie in some of the connections and contrasts with Tange that also addressed Tokyo Bay and other things that we'll touch upon. And also to bring us to present day and beyond, Florian Edinburgh, who many of you know and probably have as an instructor here on the faculty, but also practicing in New York with Soil, and notably working on the new museum in New York with Sana, Sejima Nishizawa Architects. And the legacy that continues from Kikutake to Toyo Ito, as many of you know from the studio, and beyond with Kazuo Sejima and Nishizawa, who are pictured in some of the images that you might see scrolling in the lobby. And then also I just want to put in a note that do go down into special collections, where there is a fascinating collection of related materials, the period of metabolism, the the World Design Conference in 1960 that was held in Tokyo, that I think really expands and highlights so much of what needs to be further examined, hopefully by the current generation. So we'll continue. So Dan, I wonder if you can start with just a few comments on the exhibition from your side.
Sure. We're going to show different. It's on.
Okay.
As part of the DVD, I'd be the director's cut. It's very much a challenge doing these types of exhibits where you're featuring a particular designer from a particular era, and at the same time you're trying not to historicize them. So one thing that we were very conscious of from the outset was the tension of bringing the work forward in time and showing that these particular issues that Kikutake was looking at and facing, in particular the social conditions of his era, you could say map to today. And so we wanted to show original artifacts. We wanted to show like the power of the artifact, the original drawings, the models. What's interesting though is that there's only 13 drawings and there's only 6 models within the show, and it really commands the space, and it has a way of commanding your attention. It's very, I would say, in many ways, I hope that the students find this work confrontational in many regards. So one of the aspects that we were very carefully going through is what is the sequence of the narrative that we're setting up for Kikutake's work, and how does that map as a spatial experience? And right when you walk in, we wanted to show instantly the sort of more visionary side of ocean urbanism, both as this mural, the actual model, but more importantly, I would say the sketches, the original moment where you, as the students, can watch someone like Kikutake begin to conceptualize his ideas, begin to realize them in these forms of representation. In this process of working it out, you're constantly making revisions, you're constantly sequencing the work. One of the things that we were looking closely at the Mori Art Museum's way in which they presented this work, and they had your classic white cube, white walls, white, and in that context, it is one type of connotation of a type of an experience. I always find white within this context to be directly associated with the informality of the classroom, the pinup. And so what I was trying to find was some way of creating a figure ground effect where, in part because the frames and the work they were created in different eras and there was such a variance, I found when you looked at the work on a white ground, your eye went to the frames, which is not where we want you to focus. So we created this really saturated field of blue, only where you have artifacts. And so what I found happened once we created that saturation was that the work within the frame, the drawings, the content came forward. And what we did was we settled on 2 gradations of blue. And that's actually a straight, pure, saturated blue. There is no other color. There's no black. There's no white. It's a pure blue. And the sky house is when we start to do these gradations. And we wanted to have that gradation signify the sort of trajectory of Kikutake's work, this very specific framing that Ken is proposing of from Sky House forward to the Marine City sequence.
So I mean, in thinking about this and backing up just a little bit of what the title is for those of you who haven't read all of the text of the exhibition of why tectonic visions between land and sea. As you enter from Quincy Street, you see this wall of ocean urbanism. But you see that contrasted with some of the residential work, the Sky House, which is a landmark house from 1958. If you can imagine your first work being presented at Siam in 1959 for this international audience and becoming the star, the international star. That's what he becomes between this sky house and this vision for a marine city, ocean city, a whole world, a whole kind of environmental complex, if you will. And so working at these multiple scales. So how do we conceive of this in these basic terms between the land in which he's expanding, creating these platforms, whether it be the Sky House or the other larger scale schemes, the Hotel Tokoen, which Thompson will talk about, and to this larger vision of a world that's beyond the borders of just Japan as a nation. And so with the blue, it does match some of the Doors and Pepper and so forth, but
which I say is a contaminated blue. If it's a pure blue on ocean urbanism, it's a joke. But I mean, one thing that was interesting to find out was this picture where the blue was the sort of ground upon which Kikutake had been using for some time, and we found these old posters of his work. He created his own line drawing, converted into white marks in this saturated blue field. Once we kind of found that research, we felt like we had a good aesthetic established.
Also, just to give a little background for the exhibition, Dean Mohsen Mostafavi visited Kikutake while he was alive and invited Toyo Ito, who worked in the office between 62 to 65, and talk about some of these legacies and how this exhibition could come to Harvard. This was before he passed away. He passed away in December of last year. But to really carry out that vision, we have it here in this window between the Metabolism exhibition that was in Tokyo, as Dan referred to last fall, and when it might travel again to other parts of Asia or Europe. But you see here, Kikutake here, at his birthday celebration, I believe in 2008. His 80th birthday, yes. In which Sejima and Nishizawa attended. So you see the blue, and how, in some ways, it's really recreating that space that he has in his office, in his living environment, etc.
We could keep going, but I don't know if you want to use this
So,
as a segue.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, since our esteemed guest, Fred Thompson, is here with the actual accounts of some of these projects, we should really focus on that. And just to segue to that, this whole period, as I mentioned, of the Metabolism exhibition, Toyo Ito re-examining this period for himself, and Rem Koolhaus in Project Japan, interviewing Kikutake while he was alive, and making this connection between his own examination of urbanism in Singapore, the megastructures there, expanding out, and maybe whether it connects to Manhattan, delirious New York, or whatnot is for further discussion. But we come. I think his spirit is here at Harvard. This is at the symposium in when the exhibition opened in September, and him almost poetically, ending his life as the exhibition itself. But one of the big projects that we see here is the Hotel Tokoen. And one of the projects that Professor worked on, just to give you a sense of what the building is, I have one of the extra features is walkthrough. So here, it's a little blurry and a little bumpy, so please forgive that. But this is as we're entering this structure. Actually, maybe you can narrate a little bit. But as you walk in, if you are a guest, to see the superstructure here. Yeah, we'll go through just a few minutes here as we go to check in.
Think there's room for all of us?
Absolutely. We have a special So this is in March, so it's still a little bit cold, but you can see some of the original furnishings, the garden out. You see this structure. And then we'll go up the elevator. Or we'll go down first, and then we'll go back up. So we'll see this garden, and then the context of this on the Japan Sea side. Yeah, we'll see it in just a second. And see the garden down below, see the mountains in the distance, and now we're starting to see the sea off in the distance. Get off the elevator and go to the view. This is the rooftop that explain further about the roof structure. Obviously, the furniture has changed. So you can see the view. Feel how windy it is with the sand. And we'll get a view of the roof, the ceiling from the inside. The terrace on the 4th level is open, as you see here, and then the stairs go up here. So let me jump to get photographs of the sketches.
These are some sketches I did of this is mine from Kiyonori Kikutake's. And the project was that there was a lack of space, they need to expand. The hotel was really in the form of an H, as you see in sketch number 1. So the question was, can we take out that center bar of the H, the horizontal bar, keep the other 2 vertical bars, and build a new hotel. And the idea originally, I couldn't find more sketches of it, was to, first of all, in Japan, you can take buildings apart, put them together again, because of the way they're made, that's part of it. Was to disassemble the the hotel rooms in that horizontal bar, lift them up in the air and put them back on platforms. So that in fact you had the same hotel rooms up there, but you could have administration at the bottom. So that leads us to sketch number 2, which was to have a space, an administration space in the H. To make it very short, one of the things that I have to emphasize in my experience in that office were 3 different buildings, which gave me 3 different insights into the way Kikutake Sensei worked and in the way the Japanese work. In this particular instance, the engineer Matsui Sensei visited us one day as we were talking about this as a group. And if you can show the picture of the Miyajima shrine. All of a sudden, they started talking about how to get these rooms up there. And there was this sort of bolt out of the blue, soka, kind of a thing. And it was Matsui Sensei saying, if we can lift this thing up in the air, or Kikutake Sensei saying, if we can lift this up in the air in pillars and hang 2 floors, and then Matsui Sensei said, no, Miyajima Shrine. And so you have the structure of Miyajima Shrine, and I haven't got the time to go through his design process today. But out of this comes the idea of that hotel, namely that by putting 2 pillars all the way up, and then supporting pillars on the bottom part where the administration was, you could put 2 great big beams across the top, hang 2 floors, disassemble the floors, put them back up. So that essentially is what happened with the space in between open, which Ken has described as an open terrace. And then on the top of it was the infamous hyperbolic paraboloids. And again, this is something about the way we work, because I didn't really understand how you made these hyperbolic paraboloids. And the Sky House, of course, roof is made of hyperbolic paraboloids. So I said to Uchi-san, how does he do this? And so Uchi-san described, and we put down 4 pillars, we put a horizontal rim, 2 cross beams at the top, and then from the cross at the top to the corner, and making little pieces of plywood, or sorry, balsa would go up. And I found this fascinating. Kikutake Sensei comes with it. Wow! There it is. I mean, it was as fast as that. He just simply put it on the top. He said, that's going to be our Japanese baths. And I say this because in working with him, he had an electric speed that there were many times when the group of us would look at each other and say, are we talking about the same building? He just moved so fast on these things. So that's the model I did that he picked up and put on the roof. And the engineer, Matsui Sensei, nearly threw me off the train once when he found out that I was the person who suggested that, because he had a terrible time trying to make it work. Eventually, it was turned into a restaurant. But, yeah, that's the Ocean City thing, if I could just say a few words about that. Because you decided on that in the opening of the exhibition, and I think Ken maybe has some sketches there that Kikutake did. You know about the World Design Conference. I came in '60, just after that World Design Conference had been. And there was, in my mind, and I think Henry can probably bear me out on this or contradict me, there was a movement, well, put it this way, My other sensei was Kikutake sensei, who wrote The Roots of Japanese Architecture and what is now called the Essential Japanese House. And he said that there are two kinds of architecture, the architecture of the rulers and the architecture of the ruled. He dealt with the architecture of the ruled, Ito sensei, which was the common houses. And that there was a movement towards, we could say, a more socialistic, I suppose, way of looking at it, urban environments, out of which comes these marine cities. And his argument to me, because my Japanese is limited, I have to tell the story. My first day in the office, he came up to me in the very congested part of Tokyo, where one of the great temples is. He had asked me to design a building which was on its site 7 meters by 20 meters. And my Japanese was pretty damn simple, it was functional. And I thought he told me to design a workshop. I filled it up with men and women and children and cats, everything I could think to fill up the space. At the end of the day, Kikutake sensei comes and just pivots around, goes back and gets Uchi-san, who's number 2, who comes in. And I said, Oterai, which means toilet. He said, oh no, Otera, temple. I was very lucky to have survived the day. I put that in because my Japanese got a little better. But the argument for the ocean cities, which I understood at the time, and there's some sketches there that he did of it for me, was that Japan was covered by, 80% of Japan was covered by mountains. 20% of us left to live on, to get food from, and communicate, transportation, so on and so forth. The other thing about Japan is that all of the everything Japan produced came from outside Japan, was made and exported again. So why should this take up 20% of the land? Hence the idea of marine cities, which started out being factories under the water, with living above and being able to commute back and forth to the land eventually, and developed various forms of that later on, so that there were actually paper factories, I believe, which were folded up like an origami and sent off to Brazil and opened up in the Amazon and actually were functioning factories. So it was, there were some manifestations of this idea that people could have a better living if it wasn't all just crowded with industrial factories and land. I think that's, we can see.
Well, that's great. We'll see a lot of this on the wall. Part of it is in our gallery talk to really engage what is there. Also, Seng has a few images to help us contrast the marine cities with Tange's Tokyo Bay Plan. And so here, the contrast.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Dan. Really, I'm very grateful to the GSD to, first of all, organize this exhibition on Kikutake, and also for hosting this panel discussion this evening. It's great to be back at the GSD and to, in a sense, revisit this experience of an exhibition on post-war Japanese architecture in the same space 3 years after the exhibition on Tange. So I was asked by Ken to speak on to, in a sense, contextualize a little bit Kikutake's work, particularly on doing ocean city projects vis-a-vis those done by Tange and the other members of the Metabolist group this evening. So on the screen here, for those of you who are not so familiar with the work of Tange, on the right, of course, is the Tokyo Bay Plan done by Kikutake in 1961. And on the left, rather, we have the same plan, the Tokyo Bay Plan, done by Tange, also done in 61, but published just a few months before Kikutake's version. Tange, I should also mention, was really belonged to a generation older, prior to that, preceding to that of the members of the Metabolist, really came of age in the immediate post-war era, as opposed to, say, the height of the post-war recovery period in the mid-50s or 60s. And in many ways, he was seen as the spiritual mentor to the young architects, the neophyte architects of the Metabolist generation. Tange, I should also mention, actually nominated, in fact, Kikutake to teach here at the GSD in the late 70s, and for various reasons that didn't quite materialize, and I suspect that was one of the reasons why Tange essentially led this effort to endow the Kenzo Tange Visiting Professorship here at the GSD in the early 80s, and 83, I think, was when this chair was founded. Kikutake was also, I think, the first person to call on the Tange family after Tange passed away in March of 2005. But Kikutake actually belonged, in a sense, in this society where genealogy matters a lot, belonged actually to a very different school of architecture than Tange or the, really all the rest of the architect members of the Metabolist group, such as Asada Takashi, Otaka Masato, Maki Fumiko, Okuwakawa Kisho, and if you count Isozaki Arata, all of them sort of belong to this school of CM-inspired school of rationalism as propagated at Tokyo Imperial University in the 1930s, 40s, and to some extent in the early 50s. Kikutake instead actually went to the rival institution at Waseda University. So in some sense, that's also an important consideration to situate Kikutake vis-a-vis his collaborators in the Metabolist movement. So comparing the marine Tokyo Bay plans, rather, done by Kikutake and by Tange, in a sense, brings us very conveniently back to the wonderful title for the exhibition that Ken had selected, which is Tectonic Visions Between Land and Sea, as he was just beginning to explain a little. Really, what I want to emphasize here, the idea of land and the idea of sea is really the leitmotif, giving significance to the seemingly decontextualized nature of the work of the Metabolist movement. But rather than focusing on the Tokyo Bay plan done by Tange in 61, instead I'd like to focus on another, the same Tokyo Bay plan done by another member of the Metabolist group, namely Otaka Masato, done just a couple of years before Tange and Kikutake's interventions. The one before. So in a sense, we can attribute the beginnings, the origin, so to speak, of this attempt to colonize, to territorialize Tokyo Bay from this project, this megastructural housing project inspired by the Unité d'Habitation done by Le Corbusier in Marseille and other locations. This is Japan's iteration of Kobu's Unité d'Habitation designed by Otaka under the while working in the office of his mentor, Mark Mulligan, who actually worked in Kobu's office for a brief period in the late 20s. It was designed in 1955 and completed 3 years later in 58. As you can see from the section on the left-hand side of the screen, in a sense, this was the kind of construction realities that Otaka, Maekawa, and their structural engineers, Kimura, actually had to reckon with when they were given this particular site. It was built on landfill in the Japan at the time until 1963 actually had a very strict building code of limiting the height of buildings to 100 feet. So Japan's iteration of the unité is actually quite a bit lower than what we find in Europe in terms of their height. But the site conditions of this particular building being built on landfill meant that the building structurally had to reach all the way down to bedrock, which was between 20 and 30 meters. So in a sense, we're given Maekawa, Otaka, and Kimura were given the situation where the building was as tall above water was it than underneath it. So, next slide, please. So here's an aerial image of the site of the Harumi apartments done by Otaka and Maekawa. It's actually one of these parcels. I think it's this one here. As you can see, it's located clearly on landfill in the middle of Tokyo Bay. In fact, it's situated in a long series of land reclamation projects as the growth of the city of Tokyo, or before 1868, was known as the gradual expansion of Edo into the harbor adjacent to it. Here we have Tsukiji, known for the famous fish market. This was actually a landfill done in the middle of the 17th century. And even before that, here, this central area really the high-rise CBD district in Kyobashi and in Marunouchi, those were actually landfill projects done in the 16th century. And this kind of work continued all the way well into the middle of the 20th century, and in fact it continues today as Tokyo Bay in a sense gets smaller, keeps on getting smaller by the day. So, well, I should speed up a little bit. So, in a sense, Otaka, Maekawa, and Kimura were given this interesting situation, and it sort of they started to wonder, with all this kind of effort that went into filling the land and then building this megastructure that had to reach all the way concrete pylons, that would reach all the way down to bedrock anyways, then what was sort of the whole point of doing landfill to start with? Why not just go straight to these pylons, in a sense, to have these floating housing slabs that would flow rather freely in the middle of Tokyo Bay. So what Otaka, Maekawa, and Kimura started to propose in the late 50s, before, in fact, Kange and Kikutake's versions of the Tokyo Bay, was this version, to have these megastructures, 4 in a set on a pinwheel pattern, and 4 of these sets would form a community of 20,000. And in fact, this would be replicated almost ad infinitum around the periphery of Tokyo Bay. And these would be layered. So here we have the layer of housing. Here we have a layer of industry. And in fact, the gist of it was that Otaka and his partners wanted to bring these awful polluting industries away from the sort of pristine shoreline and to reclaim, in a sense, Tokyo as this wonderful landscape of pastoral beauty. So I want to show you just a couple of examples of what other members in government, working for government think tanks, were trying to do to Tokyo Bay, also in the same period, in 58 and 59. These were done by, commissioned by somebody called Kano Hisaakira, who was in fact the president of the Japan Housing Corporation when it was founded in 55, and he was the same person who commissioned Otaka to build the Harumi apartments in the first place. So he, in fact, in 58 and 59 proposed two schemes. One that was premised upon using nuclear bombs to demolish the mountain range on the eastern shore of Tokyo Bay, to use the landfill, to rubble and fill up Tokyo Harbor, to actually, in a sense, to territorialize it and to make it inhabitable. So, which there's obviously a longer version to this presentation, but which bring us back to. But I see that Ken is trying to hurry me up. But to bring us back to Kikutake's work, I should also mention that of all the members of the Metabolist generation, in a sense, Otaka, the designer of the Harumi apartments and the Tokyo Bay plan that we just saw, and Kikutake, both are the two who had sort of provincial agricultural backgrounds. Otaka coming from Fukushima Prefecture in the north, and Kikutake coming from a very wealthy land-owning family in Kyushu in the southernmost in southern Japan, western Japan. And I should just finish with this quote. When Ram Koolhaas and Hans Ulrich Obrist were doing the interviews with Kikutake in, I think, 2008, Kikutake sort of made this confession to the two of them, saying that my architecture was my protest as a former landlord against the dismantling of Japan's entire land-owning system. So Kikutake and Otaka, coming from these rural backgrounds, had first to say, Kange and Kurokawa both came from banking families, families who did banking or trading, had this deep emotional attachment to the land and sea, and this is very much reflected in the kind of schemes, urban scale schemes that I think very clearly expressed this deep yearning to reclaim Japan's landscape from industrialization and urbanization.
What we're weaving together are the multiple stories, but Professor Thompson here, going to Japan through his meeting Mayakawa, perhaps you want to mention briefly, but how Mayakawa actually becomes a conduit for this in Professor Thompson going to Japan, and this right after the World Design Conference, in which a lot of this is actually presented.
Very long story, very short. I'm married to a Swede, and when I graduated, we decided that we wanted to go to Japan, but we couldn't get a visa, and I was a scholar. So we went back to Sweden and spent some time there. And Mayakawa Kunio was the architect on site for the Swedish embassy in Tokyo. So he visited Sweden. My brother-in-law, who was the president of the Architectural Association in Sweden, told us that Mayakawa was there, so we went up to meet him. Mayakawa said, "Oh, I don't know why you want to come to Japan. We have 5,000 architects a year. We need to export them. We don't need any imports." In fact, I helped him export them, but that's another story. He was instrumental in going to the Japanese consul and convincing them to give me a visa for research. God knows what the research was. I just turned it on and said it was surgery work. So my wife and I bought a Volkswagen and we drove for 8 months through Europe and the Near East, the Middle East, the Far East, until we came to Cambodia, and there was a coup d'etat in Vietnam, so we came back and took a ship to Japan with the Volkswagen. And Mayakawa...
That's not the Volkswagen we see pictured under the sky.
No, that's not it. Yes or no, actually. It was in this kind of. Mayakawa's brother, as they call him in Japan, was a man by the name of Ken Ichiura, who was doing public housing. And he set me up to work with Ken Ichiura, which was a very difficult, coming from a background where we have so much space and we can do housing the way we want to see how Japan was doing housing, public housing. And I worked there for several months, and it actually took eight months to get to Japan and 9 months to get the car into Japan. Another story. When I got the car into Japan, I left Ichiura's office and made a trip. I should also say that I was introduced to Ito Teiji, who had written 10 volumes on the farmhouses of Japan. And Ito Sensei gave me a card for every one of those houses in those 10 volumes as a letter of introduction. And I set off in the Volkswagen to see all of these houses all through Japan. And I said to Ito Sensei, I would like to work, and the words I used were, I would like to work for an architect who isn't yet in the cocktail line. And he said there were two, Kikutake and Motaka. And when I was on my travels, I saw one of Kikutake's buildings, and I said, that's the person I want to work for. And when I came back to Tokyo, a person who worked in my brother-in-law's office, a Japanese person, was visiting Japan. He said, is there anything I can do for you? And I said, yes, please introduce me to Kikutake. And hence, I started to work in Kikutake, actually under the park, where the car was parked. We had an office which was from the edge of the desk to the window, and about half the size of this room, and I think there were 12 of us in there. We had a little wee table. We actually had no pencil leads for our pen. We had to take a razor blade and cut them out of a wooden pencil, put them in our... And it was cold in the winter time. There were 2 oil burners, and we'd go to warm our hands to draw. So, I mean, it was... He was becoming very famous, but at the same time, he really... he wasn't in the cocktail line.
We have many interactions. Mark with Maki, Florian with Sana Sejima. Perhaps we can have a few more comments.
I had a few comments prepared, and I realize it's hard to follow after atomic bombs and Volkswagens escaping coups in Cambodia. I feel very tame by comparison here. I was really touched by your description of the hyperbolic paraboloid roofs, and there was a certain popularity and trendiness there, but also there was a curiosity about technique. And I'm struck by the model I saw outside of the Sky House, where the hyperbolic paraboloid is actually literally constructed out of pieces of wood, each of them sort of following the rules of a ruled surface. And very impressed with that as a technique. They didn't need the 3D printer in order to produce such a complex form. It's very, very beautifully crafted. Ken actually said maybe I should say something about the wood models in the lobby. It's not at all what I prepared, but I will say I am very, very touched by the thought that those models, many of them produced 50 years ago, have lasted, have endured. I think many of them have been repaired here and there, but that you can see that they're quite old and quite sturdy. When I first went to work at Maki's office, and the situation maybe not so dissimilar to yours, and maybe the first day of the office is quite shocking. And I've been to the temple instead of the toilet many times. I'm sure, Florian, you probably got your horror stories as well. But I remember working on a concert hall competition where, fresh out of the GSD, we made basswood models here. That's what we did. We enjoyed the craft of that. And I went with this, and I knew the Japanese love of wood, and proceeded to make a bunch of sort of sketch models out of wood. I went out and bought it at Tokyo Hands, and the rest of the team wouldn't look at them. They told us, this reminds us of old-fashioned 60s architecture. They equated wood with this period of metabolist architecture and the construction system in concrete that was heavy and was of a past era. So the wood has associations and resonances that weren't expected to me as a foreigner, but I quickly kind of got up to speed. And, I told Ken that, you know, that's where foam core, this amazing, beautiful Japanese foam core that I've seen many times at Sejima's office, became the working, you know, medium for models and exploration. And pretty soon, it actually in Japanese architecture today, I mean, with Fujimoto and Ishigami, it's really, I mean, it's become white architecture made out of abstract stuff. So it's kind of interesting how materials, even in model form, have those resonances. I had a couple, but I had a couple of thoughts, and I'm just going to make these points. I didn't bring slides, but I do have some thoughts. I have to apologize, first of all, you know, as somebody who follows a lot about Japanese modernism, maybe it's the fault of having worked at Maki's office that I never was that closely associating myself with Kikutake. There is some sense of they were both, and Kurokawa, they were all metabolists, but they'd gone their separate ways, and there were definite philosophies and schools associated with those. So it was only later, I think, after I'd left the office, that I developed a bit of an appreciation. I must say I have a fondness for the Sky House as a kind of a very authentic piece of architecture that, in a way, I think is a great lesson for students, but also for architects, that if you're going to design with the idea of metabolism, the Nakagin Capsule Tower is a far better known icon of metabolism, but it has never changed in 40 years. Nobody has ever taken one of those capsules off. And so, although it illustrates the expressive potential of a capsule plug-in system that is interchangeable, in fact, in the reality of its construction, has never lived up to any kind of ideal. And the way that he constructed it, Kurokawa had to know it was impossible to disassemble without taking the whole thing apart. There's a kind of honesty in the way that Kikutake approached his own house with the modesty of the movement system, the modesty of the changes that he made relative to his own challenges, not only as an architect and a husband, also as a father of children, and the way that he converted his home from age to age, I think represents somebody who's very much an idealist, confronted with realities, who then has to acknowledge that maybe some things he's done in the past weren't viable, and then have to change. I think that actually for a very famous house, it takes a lot of courage actually to say that what has not, you know, what has worked in the past doesn't work, and it will now change. I think that there's a, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, the Marine City, which Sang you've talked about so eloquently, I want to say that maybe there's a reason why Marine City remains the single architectural image that people go back to look at the metabolism movement for utopian visions. We can look at the plan of Tange for the Tokyo Bay project. We can look at many, many other plans and sort of in the language of planners, the Otaka or Maekawa schemes. Many other people had versions of what happened in Tokyo Bay, but there's a figurality and there's a kind of a beautiful three-dimensional realization in Marine City that I think is unequaled. And when I saw that model out there in this beautiful blue plexiglass, I was just kind of knocked out. And I said to Ken, we have to photograph this. We have to get this into the lab. So I'll save some other comments for later. I don't want to take too much time.
Very quickly, I mean, you know, the whole question of what is metabolism? I mean, we see this through the Sky House of it constantly changing, and this human pursuit of, you know, living in it, constantly tinkering with it. And you know, we see Kikutake passing away, but you know, what comes in this next generation? There is the quote of metabolism, both actually down in special collections, but also we have an account by Maki at Kikutake's memorial service this past March, in which he described metabolism. You know, there is the whole notion of it as an organic movement of change, but also as a movement of like a baseball team, and these architects coming together really with this effort to win. But that Kikutake was the pitcher. He was the kind of main man throwing the ball, Tange and Isazaki were back behind the catcher, kind of in the stands. I think Maki-san was at either first base or somewhere a little bit off, and then we can fill in all the other people. But it is this movement that isn't just an individual. That it is these people coming together, and then the game is over. Other things happen. The Spice Girls came together, and then they just. But different generations. But I think Lauren has another perspective on this, perhaps maybe more recent.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think I also ended up at Stable Group by accident, but I will. And I think there's many anecdotes tonight. I will start with also my first, I would say, night at Sana. So I was eight years I worked for Sana. 4 years of that in Japan, and 4 years here in the US. And indeed, the first night I was asked to make a tree for an exhibition in a model, a 1 to 20 scale tree. And I worked on it for about 4 hours, and I think 1 or 2 a.m. I went home. And the next morning I came back, there was this beautiful tree built in front of the model, which wasn't the model I made. And I have since never been asked to make a model anymore at Sana. But what I did do, because I was one of the, at that time, non-Japanese that stayed for a longer period of time, it was right at the moment that Sana was gaining international recognition. They were working on Mele and some other international work. And so I ended up often having to answer questions that were asked by foreign press to Sejima and Nishizawa, and often the question of how did you get into architecture. And it was actually this image that you're showing here, and this is also the way I became familiar with the work of Kikutake. Obviously, everybody knows that Sejima worked for Toyo Ito for a number of years, I think 8 years. But Nishizawa at some point said it was not Ito who was actually the inspiration for Sejima, but this Kikutake. And it's actually this image. And so we spoke when I had to answer these questions about how her life had developed over time to foreign press. She mentioned that Sejima saw this image as a high school girl in a magazine, and at the end of high school she had to make a choice of what career she would follow. She remembered this image, and this is how she chose to be an architect. And then obviously that's how she started to work for Ito, and I think it has been very influential on her career. And I think it's interesting now to see, or this is what I think is very interesting in Japanese architecture, is to see these lineages and sort of the generations that follow from one to the other, and also how, say, these lineages are not necessarily defined by personalities or egos. Obviously, the metabolists, there were some strong egos there, but how basically these practices are based on dealing with a topic, and this topic sort of evolves over time and gets handed over to the next generation. And if you think of Kikutake as somebody who was very much interested in sort of the role of technology in relation to society, and the role that technology would play in relation to society, how, say, in Kikutake's case, the technology was the technology of construction, and where Ito takes this over and sees that the technology becomes more the mediated technology, and the digital technology, and then how Sejima takes over that relationship between, say, architecture and a society in which technology and the digital has become completely ephemeral and actually has sort of dematerialized. And I think this is a very interesting lineage to see. And now I was actually 2 weeks ago with Ishigami having some drinks, and he was showing me his new office. And I will say the office conditions really don't get better every generation. I was in a basement in the Roppongi, which used to be a Chinese illegal gambling farm. This is where Ishigami has his office. But anyway. What was very interesting, and this is maybe a thing that takes us back to the very early work of Kikutake, which is the work he did for the Bridgestone company, which was basically the disassembling and reassembling of wooden structures. Ishigami now is working on a project for elderly housing where he's basically taking, I think, 20 or 30 existing wooden structures throughout the country and reassembling them in a home for elderly housing. And so it's interesting also to see how maybe they went from wood to concrete to steel and now back to wood. So these things just go on and on and on and on.
Well, I know this discussion could go on and on
Yeah.
and on. But I think it'll be great to actually see the images and talk about them directly. There are refreshments in the lobby, I understand, and so it can be convivial in that way. I just want to say one last word of the tectonic visions, this inspiration, this utopian notion that perhaps we see less of today, but that I think is actually still very important, and how it becomes very important to actually see how you realize that. From the sketch to the model, the passion in which everyone came together to build these models is the first step in building that which I think you really see in these models on display, which Toyo Ito says really was the heart and soul of the office, and which you'll hear about directly from him at the end of the exhibition on October 16th. And will be a homecoming in some ways for those of you who are in the Tokyo studio who directly worked with him in this process and seeing the multiple generations, this cycle as it goes through generations. The technology does change, obviously, which we see, I think, in the exhibition itself. We won't be able to do this without Skype or without scanners and the printer in the way it is. But finally, if you go down into special collections, you'll see some of the accounts by Allison and Peter Smithson on the Metabolists and other accounts. But I think it's interesting what they say of, quote, the notion of metabolism was beautiful, of a building fabric, a town fabric, which could organically adapt to circumstance, which had the possibility of change built into its genes. It was a Japanese notion that should not be betrayed or abandoned by Japanese architects. But I think, it's a wake-up call to look at this broader context, look at both the heritage, but also the way it can evolve over time in this broader international context. And so I think Kikutake would be extremely happy to see this happen here at Harvard, and this notion of the kind of social interaction that we see in the lobby is very much what he was thinking in terms of, I think, this three-part katachi, but of how you set up these human relationships that are organic, and part of why we have this roundtable discussion that's a little organic, but brings out many different human touches that I think are important for design. And so maybe we'll move to the lobby and talk further there directly.
I'll just walk through, and we have the microphone so you can actually hear us. But just to point out a few things that you might not see otherwise, and really start to engage them. Yet, really, I think, fantastic to have these models in the lobby, to have the original drawings, where you see so many different things. But with Fred Thompson here, we can get some of the accounts of that moment of design. The Myakunojo auditorium there will end up with is really interesting through his description. But just very quickly, starting off again with the tectonic visions between land and sea, you'll notice that there is here land for man to live, sea for machine to function. This was presented at the 1959 Siam conference in Waterloo in the Netherlands by Tange, as Sang was talking about. But we see this marine city juxtaposed with his scheme for the district of Ikebukuro in Tokyo. That is this major redevelopment. So you see the scheme that can be on the water or it can be on land. This is pre-Photoshop, and so you see things cut and paste quite literally on the collage. But you'll see how this idea really evolves and how these units, as we turn the corner here with the Sky House that, as Florian mentioned, really inspired Sejima to become an architect, and where he had his 80th birthday in 2008, in which Iwan Ban, the photographer, photographed that large-scale mural image of the space so we can get a sense of being in space.
Can you say something about Hattie?
Oh, absolutely.
This is the Sky House through time.
So we have here the Sky House through time, modified by Hattie. Stroud. If you're stuck in front, you can you can point to various modifications that's a little bit shy now. But it is highlighting the many different changes through time. It's listed as 1958 to 1985. One could argue it continues to the present day because it is constantly changing based on the use. The son lives there now. The office is just kitty corner from that. But here in the diagrams, you start to see the different configurations in which the move nets, which you see over here, were hung from the structure. And the eldest daughter, Yuki, was living. You'll see that in the film at the end. But you can also see where the office was, in which I mean, I wonder if you want to say just a few words about how it was when you first arrived in the early 60s.
It was, in the photo that is up at the top left-hand corner there. One of the things that doesn't appear in the drawings is the movement of that staircase, which at nighttime, there was a hinge in the middle of it, so you drew it up like a drawbridge. And nobody could get into the house. The office was underneath it, and the move nets, of course, were the principal idea that by moving the washroom or the kitchen around or adding things to it, you form the space. Space was not what we call SPACE. Space was forming. And I think that the important thing that I got from much of his work is the idea of a gerund rather than a noun and a verb. Instead of space, it was spacing. Instead of form, it was forming. Because he always had this idea that if it stopped forming, it was on the tablet and dead. So it was always moving. And I was telling Ken that a few years ago, I was there after his first wife had died, and he took me up into the building, and there was a memorial to his wife with a very large picture and a very large space meeting 8 lamps in front, and a bell and incense. And that space to me had been converted into a temple, into a religious space, and it took the breath out of me, and of course I couldn't photograph it. It would have been an insult to his wife and to the respect I had for her and for him. But it moved me that that house was still alive with potentials. It was still forming. It didn't stop forming.
I mean, you see these move nets here in the drawings, but you see how also this notion of the 10 meter by 10 meter living space could be translated into a unit, whether it be for
the mass prototypical housing that you see here, but not absolutely limited to 5 floors. So the 5 floors maybe a little bit akin to the 5 trays here at the GSD, where you see the space in between is where people are gathering, just like we are right now. Here you see the movement that's Kong, as I mentioned. So if you can imagine living in this bedroom here, you would climb through this 60 centimeter by 60 centimeter square down this ladder into this space. This photograph is, I think, misleading in that it looks much larger than it is.
I don't really realize that this whole thing is built on water. And in the intersections of water, you both floors. So that you could attach things underneath, move that's the same way as you attach them around the building. And that's what that is. And then it eventually became a T-house. When you began to go up, you took that out and you put it in the T-house. So it was known as a kangaroo house. It was always changing. And even to the extent that in this, you see the idea of movements being attached with the principal thing to affect the space over time.
When we look at the Sky House in its present day iteration, you see how it has changed. It's no longer with a bedroom and dining space, the kitchen's been placed down below. But the proportions of 10 meters, I think, is really quite amazing, I have to say. It feels very comfortable, and you have this floor, but then you also have the HP shell roof that really is uplifting. And so it is, I think, extremely keen scale. You'll see at the end some of the images that Iwan took, and you'll see Sejima and Ishizawa in space admiring it. But so hopefully you can imagine yourself in the space through Iwan photo. He will be here at the end of September to photograph this space, so we'll have him photograph to photograph.
His English wasn't very good, his probably not as much Japanese, but he was always talking about just space, meaning just the right space for a contemporary family. And this was his ultimate ideal of what the just space for family was. But it was permeating everything he did, just space.
So as we go up in scale, we have the Hotel Tokoen. We have the virtual shaky tour on the screen, but here you can see the stair core here that goes up. You actually will see the sectional drawing of the stair, whereby you see it's all cantilevered out. And so because the floors are slightly different heights, and cantilevers at a different dimension at some points, and he's extended out even further to have space for a vacuum cleaner. And so he's thinking about every detail in how you use it, but how it will also fit into this broader landscape that you see here, this Japanese garden designed by the famous sculptor Nagare, and how this is actually at a hot springs, and so you can go and get into the pond here. It's hot. It is co-ed, but you do go in clothes. But if you have an opportunity to go to the Japan seaside, I highly recommend it.
You'll see a little bit more of this in the Taisha building, but if you look at this main beam up here, these 2 floors are hung on iron rods about the size of my thumb, which means that when you're using tension, you have very little, have to use very little compression of the main members which go up. So the main members go all the way through this beam, and these smaller ones in here are stabilizing.
You can see some of the structural drawings here. One direction.
No, I've got an answer. You want me to talk about structure about this building?
Just what your take on this.
Fred just described it. But let me interrogate a little bit because I had a line. So you're saying that from this beam there are actually tension cables coming down that are minimizing the spans between here, right? They're allowing the effective span of the slab to be something like this, that, and so on. And that's an effort to make it slender, right?
Well, I don't know that it was slender, because the fact was he went 2 floors up in the air to take those floors out and put them back in up there. And all he had to do was stop those 2 floors.
It's a beautiful transparency here. I also, I commented to Ken earlier today how important, how this building and its image would change. And so now that I know that Fred was the author of the HP shell, how that building and its image would change if it didn't have that sort of figural roof on top. It would look like many, many other buildings of a kind of engineering look, a kind of an engineered aesthetic. But with that roof, it has a kind of figural compositional quality that I was complimenting earlier today. Now I know who was responsible for it.
One thing, you can see how the peak here really is complementing the peaks that surround the hotel. And so it does fit in, I think, extremely gracefully. But also, one aspect of these columns, these super columns, I've been told is that they didn't want to have large columns in tatami room spaces. And so here you see in the corner, you don't have the massive column right at the edge in the column, in the corner, that it is open. And so you get that expanse of the landscape of the sea and the mountains. And I think really that sense of floating, having stayed there.
Same as the Sky House.
So absolutely, you look at the Sky House, it's open on the corner.
The interesting thing about this Katachi is he starts with an image. The image for that Sky House was a piece of Korean furniture which he had in the room, which had the legs on the long sides of the doors.
Also, Khan was there in 1960 in May during the World Design Conference, speaking with Kikutake, translated by Maki, talking about notions. Served and servant space is very much, I think, akin to the katachi of the kind of primal structure and how it evolves with technology. And so you see that manifest. Those ideas, whether it be in the Sky House, Hotel Tokoen, or here the competition plan for the Kyoto International Conference Hall. I just want to point out that these drawings here are for a competition. They are not working drawings. We might think in the detail of these chairs and of the structure and the dimensioning of everything, that this is for the actual construction, but it is for the competition. And so we see Kikutake rising higher and higher in fame and in confidence and scale, but he loses the competition. And so perhaps Professor Thompson can say a few words about that.
I'd like to talk, it was political. So what I'd like to talk about instead is an experience, one of the experiences I had in Japan I brought away came from this competition. We were putting a Quonset hut for 2 months, and we didn't want to go home and get trophy, so on there. But that's not the point. The point was that in order to do this competition, he gave us each roles to play. And we had roles played in research, for example, mine was to find out where important meetings take place. And I couldn't believe that they didn't necessarily take place in great halls, they took place in hallways, so it's a lot cool kind of thing. Somebody else was responsible for structure, and somebody else was responsible for what I learned from it was how important it was for him in the cooperative way that he worked, that you respected the role you were given, and you became the expert in that. And to me, it brought the whole idea of teamwork to another level, because we needed it in order to be effective in designing something as complicated as this. So I could always go to Fuji-san and he would ask him about whatever he was working on. The story, I think many people thought that he was going to win this competition, and there were many magazines behind it. He didn't win the competition. And one of the stories, or many stories, was that there was a disagreement between the judges, which allowed him not to choose the best. I'll leave it there.
So perhaps we'll expand on that later. But and before we lose everyone, there are a few, I think, really important projects. The Ocean City we've heard about. Well, you can really follow on the wall the development through the course of 50 years. But I would like to really focus at this point at the Yakunoto model that you see here. This was probably the most expensive model to ship here from Japan via the Dreamliner on a New JAL flight directly connecting Tokyo with Boston. You see how incredible a piece of work it is, but there's a very interesting story about what it is that you might think of it as being organic, but fill in a little bit about how it is.
The original idea was that this roof would be like a fan. The roof would collapse, and the whole theater would be open to the air. And it would screen. It proved to be too expensive to make that kind of mechanism. So it was not enough. I believe a couple of sketches out for just people.
So when you're designing it, when you're designing, and you have this crazy idea, and you see the kind of sketches and the kind of derivation of that, you see actually how it was built. It continues to stand. It does leak, but all great buildings do leak. And I just also want to say, as you walk through the space, when you come in from Quincy Street, when you come in from Cambridge Street, perhaps you will see different views. But especially when you come in from Cambridge Street, you'll see the sketch of a jellyfish that is on the cover of his third monograph, and this notion of a floating organism on the sea and how that has such potential to be an inspiration for this whole organic world. But you also see the Aquapolis that was built for the 1975 Okinawa Expo, and in which he realizes many of the ideas here of the marine city, and it is unfortunately not still extant. It's shipped to Shanghai and used for scrap, but how these ideas do evolve, how it is developed, there are possibilities for further development as we think of ecological urbanism, how infrastructure can start to shape both the land and the sea. I think there are a number of questions that this raises about contemporary practice, the scope of what architecture, landscape, urbanism means, what models, what sketches mean in terms of architectural design practice and process. And so with that, hopefully you will come to Toyo Ito's lecture at the climax of this exhibition with I think a number of questions that hopefully you will start to address. There is a further continuation of this in special collections. So we'll head down there. And before we do that, we'll just have one quick moment of the Izumo Administration Building that we see here in the model form.
Izumo building is really two columns, one at each end, beams, and then rain screen pieces that are put in. You notice in the rain screen that you see a picture of it, that the space, the openings at the bottom are larger than the openings at the top. In other words, the gradation, so the rain when it falls at a different pace as it goes to the next one. The other thing, and they were taken away if they wanted to expand it. The other thing that is interesting about it is these walls, which have that sort of parallel pattern. In the countryside where this is, the farmhouses have an L-shaped hinge around them. They're drawn all through the fields. They have this large cedar hinge. That's because the storms off in Japan seed hit the houses, and that shields the houses. That became the image for these end pieces. And what it did was, if you can imagine this as the form for casting those end pieces, you made a herringbone form. And then in order to give it that lopsided kind of feeling, he threw metal chips into the form. So that when the concrete is then brought up into that position, and the rain hits it, it rusts in this kind of pattern.
So if you want to grab a drink, or if those of you who need to go back to the studio need to go, I understand. But we will continue in special collections in about 5 minutes. We'll be downstairs just to get